In this following tutorial, we are going to apply and paint textures onto our terrain. To access the terrain texture layer menu, go up to terrain and choose texture. You can also see that I have this binded to a hotkey, and you can do so by going to tools, customize keyboard, keyboard, and bind it to the texture with assigning the key to it. So let's go ahead and open the textures. Here you can define various layers, assign a texture to them and the material, and paint that layer on top of your terrain. We are going to create a couple of layers, one for grass, one for rocks, and then we're going to paint those textures onto our terrain. You can create new layers in the menu here. You can add a layer. This will create a new layer. You can delete a layer. You can move layers up and down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the default, and I'm going to change the texture and the material. So let's go ahead and rename the default texture. This is the default grid that you see right now, and you can see that materials, terrain, default. This is what we see. Here's the preview. So let's go ahead and rename it. So by selecting the layer, you can double click on the default, and let's rename this to grass. Next, we want to change our layer texture, and we want to set a different material to use for our terrain. Now, there are two important components of painting your terrain. One is the texture, and the other one is material. This texture is a low detail texture with only the color information, and material is the high res texture that you see when you're close up to the terrain. So when the camera moves away, you will switch between a material that the player will see up close, and when the player walks away from it, it switches to a texture, which is just the color information. Now, to give you a better understanding of how this happens, I'm going to open up the forest example map. Now, since this is a very important part of terrain creation and texture painting inside CryEngine, I want to make sure that you understand the difference between the two. So let me get rid of some of these objects so we can better see the terrain itself. So I'm going to get rid of the clouds, decals, fog, vegetation, and some shadows, and jump over to the layers and delete some of these objects that we see. So as we get closer to the terrain, we can see that this is the detailed texture that has been painted on the terrain. As we get further away, you can see that the terrain begins to switch to a texture. So from a high detail material to a single color texture. This improves the performance of your terrain by switching between the two. So as we get closer, you can see that terrain begins to switch over, and then as we zoom out, you can see that it begins to switch over to a color texture only and get rid of the high resolution material. Now, the switch between the detail texture and the regular color information texture is controlled by the distance, and you can find this distance inside the terrain tab, environment, and here on the terrain you have detail layer view distance ratio. So if you change this value to something smaller, you can see that it switches over. So let's put it down to 0.1. So you can see everything has switched over, and as I get closer, only then will the high detail texture will pop into play. And you can see as I zoom out, it begins to really shift into color information only, and then into material high res texture as we get closer to it. Now that you understand the difference between the two, let's paint our own textures and materials onto this terrain. So let's open up the texture, and we're going to select our layer grass, and we're going to change the layer texture. So let's go ahead and click on change layer texture, and we're going to choose gray.dds. This is a very low res texture that comes standard with CryEngine, and it's a 4x4 pixel file size. It's found in game, texture, default folder, and the reason we're using the gray.dds, this very low res, first of all, we can paint the color manually, which we'll do just in a bit, and this gray.dds, this is the texture that is used in every single layer in the example map. So go ahead and choose gray.dds. The next thing we want to do is we want to define the material. So click on materials, and you can see that the default material is what is currently applied to our terrain, and we want to go in the terrain folder, open this up, and let's choose grass. In here, this is the grass material. You have quite a few options in here you can take a look at of how Crytek used to set up their own materials. We have a diffuse texture that we can see here. When you hover over, you'll have a preview, and we have a bump map. So let's go ahead, select grass material, then we want to have this window open, jump over to the terrain texture layers, and we want to assign this material that we have selected by clicking on assign material. You can see the material terrain grass has been applied. Let's close this and close the material editor. Right now we don't see any changes. That's because we need to generate our surface texture by going up to File, Generate Surface Texture. This default is fine as is. To speed up the process, you can set this to lower. When the map is final and you're ready to release or get the highest quality possible, you may want to check high quality. But for right now, to get things going and so they move a lot faster, you can leave everything at default. So now we changed our texture and material. As we zoom in, we can see our grass. Right now it's set to gray. That's because we will paint the color into our material, and as we zoom out, you can see that the gray low-res texture is being applied as well. Now let's set up our second layer. Let's go to terrain texture layer. Let's create new, and let's change this to rock. And let's create one more for underwater. I'm going to change the texture layer for both of these to the same gray.dds file, the low res. And let's do the same thing for the underwater. And for rock, I'm going to change the terrain default to Cliff Island. Once we have this selected, click over, let's assign material. It's assigned, and let's do the same thing for underwater. Let's click on this and let's select something like the Papples _3. You can take a look at what they look like here by hovering over the diffuse. We have a speckle map and we have a bump map. So once we have this selected, jump over and let's assign material. Now right now none of these will show because we haven't painted anything yet. So now let's begin to paint in our texture information into the terrain. So first I want to modify and change the color of our grass. Right now it's gray, and to do so, go over to the terrain tab and click on layer painter. Here if we scroll down, we have the 3 layers that we created, and by choosing each one you can paint in that layer. So we have grass set. Right now this is set to white, but what we can do is we can paint in the color information, and when we are close up to the terrain, we will also have the detailed material that we see right now, and it will match the color of the grass. And then when we are out, it's going to change to the green that we set here, and we will get rid of that high resolution information of the material. So let's select color. Let's set it to something more manageable, so something that looks like grass. Click OK and make sure you hit apply, and we can reset the brightness as well. And let's go up, make sure we have grass selected. We can set the radius a little bit higher, hardness. So let's zoom out and let's get a really big brush going, large radius, because we want to apply this grass texture to our entire terrain. Let's bump up our speed so we can fly around the map a little faster, and I'm just going to go over the entire terrain, make sure everything is green. So now if we zoom in a little closer, we can see that our grass is green. Next thing I want to do is let's paint into the underwater area. So I'm going to select underwater. I'm going to set this color to a little bit more gray, something like this, a little bluish. Click OK. Make sure I hit apply to keep this information in. What we want to do is when we paint our underwater texture, we want to set our altitude to 10. I don't want to paint anything higher than 10 because our water level is set at 10. So I can quickly paint and not worry about painting our underwater texture on the grass or any other area above the sea level. And to check where the water actually is, at what level, let's go to the terrain editor window. You go into modify, set water level. We can take a look at that. Our water height is at 10. So back to the layer painter, make sure we have underwater selected, our altitude set at 10, and we can begin to paint. And it will not paint anything higher than 10. So if we get a little closer under the water, we can see that we are beginning to paint our texture. So let's zoom out again and let's just do a quick sweep of the entire area so we make sure that everything underwater is painted. Now let's just go around our terrain, and to get rid of the water so you can paint a little bit better, we can switch over to the display tab and click off the ocean. So now we can take a look at, we have our texture for underwater painted. Let's turn it back on. So our next part, we want to paint the rock. So by selecting this rock texture, we can again set our altitude at what altitude this will paint the texture on. So I want to make sure I set this to 10 because I don't want it to be painted anything below underwater. And for slope in degree, I want to set this to anything higher than 45 to 90 degrees. It will paint rock, and it will not paint anything that is below 45 degrees. So I can begin painting, and you can see that it's beginning to add rock texture to other areas of the terrain, but not everywhere. Actually, maybe I want to increase this, so let's go down, let's set it to 30. And this will add a little variety on higher sloped mountains. So as we zoom in, we get to see the rock, and as we move out, we get to see the white. And again, I forgot to include the color information. So let's choose something more that's going to match to what the actual rock looks like, the color of it. So let's bump this down, something like this, maybe more gray. Click OK, and let's do it again. And you can see that it painted in more something that looks like a rock. And as we zoom in, we get to see the high detail information, and as we move out, we get to see the low res color information texture. Now eventually what we will do is we will begin to place vegetation, grass, trees, and various rocks into our landscape. So this repetition of the texture will not be as noticeable as you see it now. And as you begin to add trees, you may want to paint in certain areas a little darker in color and other areas a little lighter. And you can always go back and switch between textures, reset the color to something a little darker and set the brightness, and paint in a different color, maybe not with this big brush. So let's turn this down a bit and maybe reduce the hardness so the strength of the brush is not that high. Maybe reset the color to something a little brighter. Click OK, and begin to paint in some of the other areas in different variety of green. So you have variety of color within one texture. So this will give you a lot of different color information in one single texture by applying the color. And if we get a little zoomed in, you can see that the color will also be applied to the material, to the close-up high-res texture, as well as to the far-away color information texture. To better understand how all this relates to a finished map, just open up the forest example and take a look how everything was done in here. If we open up the terrain texture layer, we can see that every single layer in here, what it's named. We can also see that for every single layer that's been created, the low-res color texture is gray.dds. It's the same one that we used. And the material, the close-up, you can take a look at all the properties for each one by just opening it up and taking a look at what CryTech used in the example map. And in the map itself, you can see that the texture is blended in with various models. There's foliage. So the use of terrain, vegetation, and the models create what you see in the finished map. We can also jump in over to the terrain tab and take a look at the layers. And let's scroll down. And here we have grass. We have all the layers that we see here in the terrain texture layer. And by clicking on each one, we can take a look at the color that was used to paint in. And to see it a little bit better, we can go ahead and turn off all the other elements. We can even turn off the detail texture. So let's go ahead and turn everything off so we can see nothing but the terrain. You can even begin to paint in some of these areas to kind of get a better understanding.